Welcome to Introduction to the Sociology of Gender and to our first video for this semester. So in this video, we're not going over every single concept that is in your reading. However, I do want to go over some of the more abstract concepts, and that starts with binaries, and then I'll finish it up with talking about some sociological theory. The sociological theory is not really mentioned in detail in this chapter, but since you don't have to have taken Intro to Sociology for this course, I do talk about it so that you can have some framework for which to view a lot of the things that we're talking about through. And so the standard for sociologists is to use these three major sociological theories. But before that, we begin with binaries. So looking at how we categorize people. So for example, in this image of my favorite animated family, the Belchers from Bob's Burgers, we get to see some gender distinction just by looking at the images of the people in the family. So how do you, looking at these images, determine who is female and who is male, right? How do you categorize these people? And why do we even need to do that? So that's what we're talking about here in this first video. So in this module, we actually start things off, I think, a little backwards. And we're going to start with you thinking like a sociologist. And so that means we're going to start with an understanding of how gender is socially constructed. And what that means is that gender is something that is a concept that's been created by society. And that concept has been created as a means of distinction. And in your text, they talk a lot about the different ways that we have created categories to distinguish one group or one status from another. And often we use those categories as ways to dictate who's inferior and who's superior, and who is higher or who's lower on a hierarchy. And so with gender, we've done so using a gender binary. And the gender binary basically means that we have categorized the state of people into two categories, and those either lean towards masculinity or femininity. And so we have created a system in society where we expect that everyone is going to fit into one of those categories. So one of the ways that sociologists study gender is by determining why we have dictated these categories, and then what it means for us in reality as far as inequalities and our lived experiences, and then looking at the different symbols and the different ways that these binaries and distinctions, including gender, go beyond humankind and, just like the things that immediately, reflect gender. So how do we gender other things in society? How do we categorize things that don't have personified characteristics? So yeah, we study the impacts, again, of the gender binary and also the effects of the gender binary. So in your reading, you see that there's a lot of talk about the body and how we have created this binary understanding of bodies, and then mentions of things that actually challenge that understanding, or that construction of a binary body. So I posed the question here: are bodies truly binary? Well, let's take a look. What is that idea of the gender binary based on? At its very core, and much of that is based on our sexual identity or our assigned sex at birth. And so that's built on the concept that, again, just like gender, that bodies are actually uh, fit into or categorized into the binary, that bodies can either only be male or female. And if you've read the reading, you already know that's not true. And if you haven't, go in there and read it. This opening reading is a really good one. It's a great way to start. Again, it's a little backwards for those who haven't taken a sociology class before, but it's a great place to start in understanding and just being thrown right into this discussion and study of gender. So Uh, that's kind of the root of that gender binary, that we took these biological bodies and used them as a way to categorize people into having more desirable physical features and characteristics versus less desirable. We problematized some bodies and we've normalized other bodies. But what we found out and what we've known for a very long time is that bodies truly are not binary, that there is a range when it comes to even sex characteristics, right? Whether it's primary characteristics or secondary characteristics, that not everyone fits neatly into this A versus B or male versus female category. Look at the discussion of intersex variation, which we're going to get into even more. And when we look at sex chromosomes, when we look at physical characteristics or those characteristics that usually emerge during puberty, when we look at genital anatomy and things like that, we can see that there is a whole spectrum and that not everyone fits clearly into having a male or female body. So now I want you to consider some examples of how the gender binary has been constructed, whether it's something that is recent or personal or current in your life or something historical, like the narrative that your text opens up with, looking at the history of men and high heels and how high heels were actually seen as being masculine, right? And gendered as a weapon, a masculine weapon or tool. And that early on, when women did wear high heels, it wasn't sexy. It was basically this form of women like gender bending and wearing this masculine element of clothing. And as a social construct, how this changed over time and how it's almost as if it was completely wiped away from our history, this idea that high heels were actually very masculine, right? So what does it mean? Why do we now have such strong reactions and feelings, to the point where in some places where a man wearing a high heel would actually be something that is seen as being taboo, right? Like in the Middle East, in particular, where I lived in the United Arab Emirates, if a man is wearing high heels, he is cross-dressing, even though this was, a weapon that gave an advantage to soldiers in the Persian army, right? So, what are some other examples of things like that that are socially constructed, right? Obviously, socially constructed. You can even go to TikTok and look for examples. My favorite was a couple of years ago how men put on chapstick versus how women put on chapstick. The idea of who can take up space and how, right? Like man spreading. Um, and then there's other examples like who can wear what color. So, what are some examples of this social construction of binaries? And when you think about it, like truly at their core, are they real, right? Is there really any like biological, deterministic, like absolute reason for why we need to split things into binaries? So typically, we discuss sociological theories in two categories. There's the macro level theories, which usually are focusing on the interaction between individuals and groups and social institutions or these larger macro structures. And then there's the micro level theories that are focused on smaller scale interactions, micro scale interactions, like individuals with groups, individuals with individuals, groups and groups, but on a smaller scale, right? Macro also looks a lot at meaning. So we'll start with the two macro level theories here, functionalist theory, and then on the next slide, looking at conflict theory. The functionalist theory is focusing on the purpose of a social phenomenon, right? What does it do in society? What does it provide? And to whom? What function does it serve? And so the functionalist perspective, or the structural functionalist perspective, or theory, or paradigm, these are all interchangeable terms, um, looks at how all of these elements of our society are like organs in the human body. They all serve different purposes, and they work together primarily towards the stability of society. Now, that stability isn't beneficial for everyone, and that's where the conflict perspective comes in later. And so we acknowledge that. But somebody, and in particular, if it's a minority, like a small numerical proportion of society, that is being benefited, someone is getting something from it, right? There's a reason why it continues to exist and persist. And so we're going to ask the questions here with the gender binary. Why does it exist? And why does it persist? Right? And most of us will acknowledge that it doesn't serve everyone equally, this binary, right? That it leaves out people, and it discriminates against people, and causes problems. And if you're just looking at, the gender binary, along the binary, you'll find that women are disproportionately impacted negatively by the binary. So then why does it exist? Right? It has to be there for some reason. What's that purpose? And we could look into the social institutions and how those institutions, like the family, education, health, right, religion, work and economy, or the government, politics, media, and sport, how do they use the binary? And then again, who benefits and how? Right. So the functionalist theory isn't really getting into the value of it. They typically try to lean towards being more objective and taking on value neutrality, but they're just trying to answer questions here. They're trying to get to the bottom of things and being really investigative and nosy in the end. So consider those questions, right? Looking at the gender binary, how might the functionalist perspective view it? The conflict theory is also macro level, and it's going to be looking at these large scale struggles over resources and powers. I mean, that is the main focus of the conflict theory. The conflict theory stems from critique about capitalism and about, in particular, this Karl Marxian, neo Marxist, um, or, like analysis of capital as the means of production, and the struggle between the bourgeoisie and the proletariat, or between the workers, right, and those who own the capital. I actually said it backwards. The proletariat are the workers, those who own the capital are the bourgeoisie. So anyway, we can apply the conflict theory to almost any kind of struggle or relationship in society. So when we're looking at a gender binary, for example, we can examine like who is the struggle between within the binary, right? The masculine versus the feminine. Which one is the more desired? Which one is the normalized state? And which one is the other state? And why is there a struggle? Who's benefiting from an inequality in the binary, right? Or who's benefiting from the inequality or struggle between those who adhere to a binary and those who do not and operate outside of a binary, right? And so usually when we're going into the conflict theory, we're looking for a fight, and we're looking to determine why there's a fight, what they're fighting over, and who's involved in the fight. So finally, let's look at the symbolic interactionist, or the interactionist theory, which, as you might recall, is our micro level theory. So again, here we're looking at smaller scale interactions, and we're primarily focusing on meanings and signs and symbols. And so one of the things that we might examine is how the binary actually influences how we interact with one another, right? What does it mean to be masculine and feminine in our interactions and in our behaviors and how we portray ourselves, right? And the roles that we play. And what are the specific things that we do in order to relay masculinity, femininity to others, right? And how do we interpret symbols or interpret like even just items like clothing and other elements of material culture through the lens of gendering. So this is kind of, um, I think a bit easier to understand if we think about something like what color should your math notebook be, right? And why is the exact and only correct answer red? Perhaps maybe it's blue as well, but usually most people will respond red. Why is that? Right? Is that something we've all been taught? Is this a written rule? No, right? Um, and so a symbolic interactionist would kind of look at this as distinctive, right? And like one color means one thing, right? And they would start to ask, like, what do other colors mean and why? And so, in this way, this is a form of gendering, of categorizing people. And that's what gender is. Gender is a set of roles and expectations that have been assigned to a category of people. And so, in the example that you get below in the content of this module, if you're in the course, you'll see that I kind of walk you through this gendering of something like meat or hamburger, right? And ask you, what gender is a hamburger and why, right? So go through these, right? Go through this example using meat and burgers for all of the sociological perspectives. But I think it's the most fun when we get into the interactionist theory. So that's where we get to have a little more fun and start doing a little more philosophizing, and just like discussion of like things that feel a bit more relevant to our everyday lives. Okay. So from here, I want you to continue this exploration in your text, if you haven't already done so, into understanding the binary. But then also, there's a lot more left in your text, looking at things like the different types of gender identities that exist in our society, and how we describe these properly as sociologists and from a sociological perspective, and how much our lived experiences really challenge the idea that a binary is an absolute. So, yeah, enjoy that. Until next time. Bye.